Hello, welcome back to the world of Ikard, where we learn how to think like the College Board and get 5s on the AP exam. My name is Mr. Ikard, I'm an AP World History instructor, and today we're continuing topic 1.2, Developments in the Dar-al-Islam. Here's a list of all the key terms that we'll cover today.
Mr. Ikard, will you timestamp these so that we can take better notes?
I always do. So let's take a look in the course and exam description for topic 1.2, governance. Here we are again in topic 1.2 of the unit guides. Last episode we focused on culture, so let's scroll down to governance. The learning objective is explain the causes and effects, the rise of Islamic states over time. As the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented, new Islamic political entities emerged, most of which were dominated by Turkic peoples. These states demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity. And the states that we're looking at are the Seljuk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and the Delhi Sultanates. Scroll down here to the last section. Muslim rule continued to expand to many parts of Afro-Eurasia due to military expansion, and Islam subsequently expanded through the activities of merchants, missionaries, and Sufis. So these are all things we're going to cover in the video today. Before we get into the Abbasid Caliphate, let's first talk about what a caliphate is. Caliph refers to the men who succeeded the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic community. These caliphs were both religious and political leaders. The first 4 caliphs were called the rightly guided caliphs. After these guys came the Umayyad Caliphate, which set up its capital in Damascus. It was during this dynasty that the term Dar-al-Islam arose. This literally means the House of Islam. It's a term used by Muslim scholars which divided the world into 3 basic parts. First is the Dar-al-Islam, the place with states under Muslim control. Next is the Dar-al-Ahd, referring to those states that have signed treaties of peace or non-aggression with the Muslims. Next is the Dar-al-Harb, the House of War, which was everywhere else. The Umayyads were pretty aggressive. But as far as dynasties go, they didn't last that long. And in 750, they were overthrown in a revolution by a family called the Abbasids, which takes us to our next key term, the Abbasid Caliphate. The duration of the Abbasid Caliphate is often called the Golden Age of Islam. During the Abbasid Caliphate, there was also significant Persian influence, both politically and culturally, and the Persians are said to be the second great characters of Islam, after the Arabs, who were the first. But even though the Abbasid dynasty technically lasted more than 500 years, most of that time was characterized by fragmentation and loss of political control to new Muslim states, many of which are ruled by the third great carriers of Islamic civilization, the Turks. So here are the 3 big new Muslim states, and all of them are ruled by Turkic peoples. We should give a brief introduction as to who these Turkic peoples are. The Turkic peoples were originally nomads from the steppes of Central Asia, where many famous nomads throughout history have come from. They moved around a lot, as nomads tend to do, sometimes seeking pasture for their animals, sometimes because of environmental change, and sometimes even as refugees fleeing from other states. But the Turkic tribes were most famous and most feared for their ability in war. They were expert horsemen and excellent archers, armed with powerful composite bows. They were mostly tribal and spent as much time fighting each other as they did raiding more settled societies. But as many of these Turks began migrating near the fringes of the Islamic world, many of them became Muslims. The warlike nature of these nomadic Turks and the unifying force of Islam proved to be a powerful combination, one which is often called the Ghazi Ideal. Like the Arabs before them, many of these Turkic peoples began to put aside their old tribal allegiances and fight together under the flag of Islam, growing into larger groups which formed into full-fledged states and eventually into mighty empires. The first state on our list is the Seljuk Empire. In the early 11th century, an Oghuz leader named Seljuk converted to Islam and began attracting more and more Turkic followers. Then they began migrating south and west, often being hired as mercenaries by other states, including the Abbasid Caliphate. As we mentioned before, the Abbasid Caliphate was completely fragmented by this time, and the Caliph had very little actual political power. But he still retained his role as the spiritual leader of Sunni Muslims, and many of the leaders of these other states sought his approval and recognition in order to gain legitimacy. The Seljuks were granted legitimacy by the Caliph under the reign of Tugril, who the Caliph recognized as Sultan, an Arabic term implying a leader of the highest political authority. The Seljuks would continue to innovate innovate both militarily and politically. Their government was decentralized. They basically had a system where rule over different regions in their empire was divided among different family members. For a little context, it was these fragments of the Seljuk state that were involved in fighting the Crusaders in the early Crusades. As the Seljuk Turks expanded westward, they came into conflict with the Byzantine Empire inside the region of Anatolia, which we now call Turkey. So you can probably guess who won that fight.
Oh, I don't know, the Turks?
Under the influence of the Seljuks and other Turks, Anatolia was transformed from an Orthodox Christian region into a majority Muslim population.
Why did so many people convert to Islam, Mr. Eichard?
Well, there were many reasons for converting to Islam. One very practical reason for converting was the Jizya Tax. Generally speaking, Muslim conquerors of new regions were tolerant of people from other faiths and allowed them to practice their religions openly. However, all non-Muslims were required to pay an extra tax. Not surprisingly, many people converted to Islam just to avoid taxes. And this is a big continuity in the history of the spread of Islam. As far back as when the Prophet Muhammad himself was leading the Islamic Ummah, people were converting to Islam just to avoid paying the Jizya tax. Another big reason for the spread of Islam was the activity of merchants. Just like we mentioned with Buddhism on the Silk Road, merchants have always been big promoters of Islam, and trade was very much encouraged by the Islamic states. So there were many Muslim merchants, and they often had a very high status in society. So many people, including merchants from other faiths, often found it appealing to join the Muslim community. But it wasn't just cynical or materialistic reasons for conversions. Many also truly believed, largely because of the efforts of Sufi missionaries. Sufis, which became prominent around 1000, practiced the more mystical side of Islam, with an emphasis on the experience and joy of having an emotional connection to God. They did a lot of dancing and chanting the Quran as well as meditation, and they built sacred shrines. They also tended to be more open-minded and less judgmental about the beliefs of other people. This tended to make them very popular and very effective at converting people to Islam. Many Muslim states, such as the Seljuks, brought Sufi missionaries along with them in their military campaigns, or even sent them ahead before the soldiers got there, as a way to sort of win the hearts and minds of the local people to Muslim influence. Let's move on to the next big Muslim state on our list, the Delhi Sultanate. The founder of the Delhi Sultanate was actually a former slave who had served in the Ghurid Empire.
Oh, can we learn about the...
No, we're not going to talk about the Ghurid Empire. Sorry.
If the College Board don't care about them, I don't care about them.
Just know that Turkic peoples had been raiding, pillaging, and conquering India for almost 200 years before the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, whereas the Seljuks were first expanding into already Muslim areas, and later into Christian areas, the Delhi Sultanates found themselves in control of a majority Hindu population. And whereas Islam and Christianity had many similarities, Islam and Hinduism were very, very different. For example, Islam is a more egalitarian religion. All Muslims, men, women, rich, and poor, are equal in the eyes of God. Hinduism, however, has a rigidly defined caste system, where differences in social class are built into the religion. Islam is clearly monotheistic. Hinduism, however, acknowledges thousands of different gods. So, not surprisingly, Islam was never able to replace Hinduism as the majority religion in India. Nevertheless, under the Delhi Sultanate, a significant portion of South Asia did convert to Islam, for the same reasons that they did under the Seljuks, avoiding the Jizya tax, merchant activities, and Sufi missionaries.
Mr. Eichard, are the similarities and differences of the Islamization of Anatolia under the Seljuks and the Islamization of India under the Delhi Sultans a good example of comparison?
Unquestionably so, my young friend. But to further compare, let's take a look at the last of the three Turkic Muslim states, the Mamluk Sultanate. So, what's a Mamluk? Actually, it's an Arabic word that means slave, and it was used to refer to slave soldiers, mostly Turks, that served in the armies of various states throughout the Dar-al-Islam. Often the slaves were freed, but were still obliged to serve their former masters. Turks were great warriors, and their status as slaves meant that they wouldn't threaten the power of the leaders soldiers who bought them. Well, that was the idea, anyway. These Mamluks were not like most of the slaves you might think of. First of all, their military prowess often granted them elite status. Over time, these Mamluks began to have more and more real power over the people that paid for them. One of the states that employed them was the Ayyubid Sultanate, which had been founded in 1171 by Saladin. The Ayyubids, like many of the states in the Dar-al-Islam, made frequent use of Mamluk soldiers. After a series of power struggles and conflicts, including repeated wars with the invading European crusaders, the Mamluks in 250 decided that they were the ones who had the real power, and decided to overthrow their Ayyubid overlords. And they established their own sultanate, which would become very powerful and last almost 300 years. The Mamluk Sultanate was militarily quite capable. It was the Mamluk Sultanate who finally drove out the last of the crusaders, and it was also the Mamluk Sultanate who were able to stop the Mongol advance, something that nobody else seemed capable of doing at that time. They would last until 1517, when they were conquered by another group of innovative Turks, the Ottoman Empire.
Mr. Eichert, can we review with a comparison of all three of these Muslim states, please?
Great idea. Comparison is an important history-thinking process, after all. First, let's look at the obvious similarities. All three were Muslim and led by Turkic peoples, and they all came to power largely as a result of having very effective militaries. They're different in terms of how their states impacted the spread of Islam. For example, the Seljuks completely transformed Anatolia from a majority Christian to a majority Muslim population. The Delhi Sultanate, on the other hand, had a much more limited impact on the religious beliefs of the population in India. But in both these states, the activities of merchants and Sufi missionaries had a big impact on the spread of Islam. In the Mamluk Sultanate, no massive change in religious beliefs occurred because the area had already been under Muslim control and majority Muslim for hundreds of years. All three states generally treated their non-Muslim communities with a degree of tolerance. In all three states, the Jizya Tax was enforced. And finally, all three states were patrons and supporters of intellectual and cultural innovation. More on that coming soon. In the next episode, we'll see the intellectual contributions of Muslim thinkers. And of course, as always, we'll continue to think like the College Board so that we can get 5s. If you liked this video, then please like this video. And if you found it useful, please subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.